Okay, so welcome again to another episode of the Cryptography Talk series. And today we are very lucky to have Zinan Lin, who is our colleague here at MSR. He graduated from CMU in 2023, I believe. And he's an expert, one of the leading world experts in privacy for generative models. And today he's going to talk to us about a very interesting topic about, it's called private evolution. I see it doesn't actually appear in the talk title, but private evolution, in my opinion, is one of the coolest and most elegant uses of DP that I've seen recently. So I'm very excited about this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim, for the introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to the talk. Yeah, so as the talk title, today I'm going to talk about our work on differentially private synthetic data without chaining, and this is done with my awesome colleagues across multiple teams in Microsoft and also our interns. Yeah, nowadays everyone, I think everyone believes that data is the new oil. From data we can do a lot of things. For example, now the very popular, very powerful foundation models, they relies on a lot of training data set, and even if we were not talking about such big things just our daily routine or our traditional workflow, there's already also many places where we need data. For example, if multiple organizations want to collaborate with each other, or if some organization want to share some data for open research to researchers, all in these cases also need to exchange data between different organizations. And if we talk about our normal productivity or any kind of developer things, we need to debug the system, what's going on, what's wrong, what's correct. We need to look at the underlying data in order to understand those issues. So we need a lot of data, but now you can think of most of the useful data are coming from the users or our people, right? So apparently a lot of high quality data that contain a lot of sensitive information about the individuals. You can say a lot of examples medical records, code or email or chat conversation or photos. They all have very sensitive information about underlying users. And because of such privacy concerns, we shouldn't utilize. We should be very careful when we utilize those data in our applications. We have a lot of policy about privacy, GDPR, etc., that has a strict requirement on how we should handle those data with sensitive information. And if we talk about technically, it's well known machine learning models will memorize the training data. So if you for example, train models on data without careful treatment, then those sensitive information might be leaked. Yeah. So how to address this issue? This is something people have been studying for some time, called differentially private synthetic data. So what I mean is this. Okay. So let's assume the user data is just human face photos. Okay. So this differentially private synthetic data is something distributionally, it is similar to original data. So it might also be some human faces images. So this is the first thing, it looks similar. But at the same time, it has strict privacy guarantee. So I'm going to talk about in more detail what privacy guarantee I meant here. But on a high level, you can think of such a privacy guarantee ensures that the leakage of the information from the original private data is strictly bounded. Okay. And the third thing is that while once we have such a privacy guarantee, there's a nice thing that if we do any post-processing on this differentially private synthetic data, we're still going to have the same guarantee. So we want to leak more information. So this means that we can use this differentially private synthetic data in any applications I talked about before, and while ensuring the privacy of the original users. Okay, so I mentioned this privacy guarantee. So for people who is not familiar with differential privacy, here I'm going to give a brief background. So,
okay.
Yeah, of course.
Just to make sure I'm understanding. So in here, when we say privacy, we're actually talking about this is being a human face who is smiling. Or is it more like the identity that is in the picture, there is a female or male with a glass or with a whatever, dark hair or long hair kind of description? Like, what is exactly that we are thinking is private here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here, like when we talk about differential privacy, we refer to those like any information that is specific to an individual. So it can be like the identity of the human, or maybe like among all the data sets, only this person wears a strange glass. We also want to hide that information. So you can think of like any information that is specific to an individual. But there's something that we want this differentially private synthetic data to capture, which is something about like distributional level information about all the samples. Like for example, if the data set is human faces is the same across all individuals, then like intuitively it's fine to release that information. Actually, to ensure data utility, we want to keep this information. So like we want those synthetic data is also about human faces. We don't want to be some random like cats or dogs. Then this data is useless. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this what is differential privacy is about? So we say like differential privacy is a property of the algorithm such that, let's say if we input two data sets to this algorithm, like these two data sets only differ one sample, and this algorithm processes each data independently and will produce some outcome. Like this outcome depends on what the outcome is depends on what the algorithm is. So like the outcome could be like a machine learning model if this algorithm is a training algorithm, or it can be a synthetic data set, or it can also be some statistical results, like take the fraction of males or something like that. And in our case, like we're just talking about like differentially private synthetic data set, so it's the result is just another data set. Okay, and the algorithm is said to be differentially private intuitively means that if an attacker sees the outcome of the algorithm, it won't be able to tell like which data set you used. Like for example, if the attacker sees the differentially private synthetic human faces images, it doesn't know like whether it's from data 1 or data 2, the original data set. Okay, so intuitively, like it means that like each sample in the original data set contributes limited bounded information to the outcome, to the synthetic data sets. So conversely, like the attacker won't be able to inject too much information about each individual in the original data set. Okay, so this differential privacy is something like a kind of gold standard to defining and quantify and protecting like those user privacy information. So it was created also by MSR since their work at all in 2006, and it's adopted in like U.S. government and industry. Okay.
So just to clarify here, when you have the DP algorithm outputting these images, so what you mean here that it outputs two models that output these images, or are you?
Yeah. So in we were targeting like just output the data set. Now, like I'm going to talk about in the next slide, some of the current algorithm actually has an intermediate step, which is output the DP model first, and then use the DP model to generate DP synthetic data. But the algorithm we are going to talk about in this talk, private evolution, directly output the synthetic data sets. But in the end, because people just want to use the data sets, so they are same like input output interface in this level. Okay, yeah. So and I won't go into too much detail about the mathematical definition of DP, but the only thing that this talk requires is that like when we say about like differential privacy guarantee about the algorithm, we use like epsilon delta, like these two numbers to indicate the privacy guarantee. So like smaller epsilon delta means better privacy. Okay, yeah. So like the before our algorithm, like the state-of-the-art or the most popular approach for generating DP synthetic data is through this DP fine-tuning. So what I mean is this: so we take a pre-trained model. So what this pre-trained model is depends on like what the data domain is. Like for example, if you're dealing with text data set, you can take GPT-2. If you're dealing with images, you can take Stable Diffusion. Okay, so we take a pre-trained model and then we use the private user dataset to fine-tune the model. So this fine-tuning is something similar to what like all people are doing nowadays, but the only difference is that here we use a special algorithm to do the fine-tuning so that the fine-tuned model will have the differential privacy guarantee. Okay, and then we use the fine-tuned generative model to generate the synthetic dataset. So this dataset will become our differentially private synthetic dataset. So it is like kind of the dominant approach, like in the past maybe like 10 or 9 or 10 years. But our key insight here is that this DP fine-tuning approach we think is no longer fits in the current large model paradigm. Okay, so what I mean by this? So as mentioned, like this algorithm requires a pre-trained model, right? So apparently, like if we use a stronger pre-trained model, we're going to get a better quality in the synthetic data set. So like what model should we use? Like if we want the most powerful model, apparently like the most powerful model are API-based models. So they're behind the API, so in the cloud. So we don't have the ways of access, like GPT or DALL-E, etc. So now, like, can we utilize those models with this DP fine-tuning approach? Like, apparently we cannot, because most of those models only provide the inference API. So we can send a request to model and they return the results, but we cannot do the DP fine-tuning. So you might ask, like, for example, for GPT models, some of the models they provide this fine-tuning API. But again, as I said in the previous slides here, for DP fine-tuning, we need a special algorithm that satisfy the DP guarantee. So it needs a special implementation, and those API does not work for that purpose. So if we use DP fine-tuning, we cannot utilize these models. Now you might ask, like, what if, let's say, like OpenAI implements this DP fine-tuning in sometime in the future? Then in my opinion, it still doesn't work. Like, why? Because let's say like I'm a company, I have a lot of customer data, or let's say I'm a hospital, I have a lot of medical records. Now it is very scary. Like if you ask me to send my those private data to a third party, OpenAI, and ask them to do the DP fine-tuning for you, like this might be like prohibited by some policy, and also it's scary. Like if you send those private data to the third party, you might leak your customer information or leak your business secrets. So even if
this is not any different than any fine-tuning, right? The DP doesn't really change matters here.
Yes. So the fine-tuning, like in many cases, like maybe the fine-tuning data set is public. Like let's say if you want the model to have a better reasoning, it's fine. Like you collect some like math or coding question from public domain and send those data to the API, OpenAI API, and ask the Netty to fine-tune. Now the special thing here, the scenario we consider here is that the data is private. It really contains like user information. Then in this case, like it's really scary if you send this data to third party. Yeah. So if those API-based model doesn't work, then the other option is we use open source model, right? So the data holder can tune the model, DP fine-tune the model by themselves. The first issue is that the quality might not be as good as the frontier API-based model. So this is the first issue. And like you might say, like for example, open source model might keep up with the closed source model very soon, right? We now have the DeepSeek, which really excels in reasoning, but there's still many other domains or many other like capabilities you want the model to have. That is like the closed source model are still the best. And even if like let's say in some future, like the open source model really excels in the performance in all aspects, then this method is still like not that easy because this DP fine-tuning, as I said, is a special algorithm, and it needs like, if the model is very large, like do the normal fine-tuning is already very expensive. Now, and this DP fine-tuning requires special algorithm. So this algorithm is even more computationally heavy and requires more GPU memory. So really like doing this DP fine-tuning is not that easy. Yeah. So, and if we think about actually like more broadly, like ChatGPT, those GPT model like came out in 2023, and now like there's no like many years now like there are already many applications like LLM assistants, LLM agents, and many startups just based on those models and really advanced machine learning field. And if you think about like the underlying reason, like why is that? It's really because like many machine learning algorithm only depends on the inference API of those models, like LLM agents. So with only inference API, we can already do a lot of things and advance many domains. But now if you think about this privacy-preserving machine learning field, like if everything's still based on DP fine-tuning, then it's really like kind of outdated and really cannot keep up with the speed of the rest of the world. So that's why like we think about this private evolution algorithm last year. So this algorithm only requires inference API to the models. And secondly, like it keeps the user data local. So you won't send any private data to the third-party API. So you can be safely use third-party APIs. And in terms of the quality, so because our this approach can utilize the blackbox API-based model, so of course it can have better quality. But we have some experiments, like even if we use the same open source model, in some cases, although we do not do any model training, we can still match or beat the performance of DP fine-tuning approach in some cases. Okay, and lastly, like because we only require inference, so we measure the GPU hours and the consumption, computational cost. Our method is also cheaper. Yeah.
So, is it in principle possible to put more resources into this private evolution algorithm and get the quality to match exactly the DP? Or
Yeah.
is it really a difference in the DP guarantee that there is? I'm just wondering, is it like if you put more resources into it, are you going to get the same as from like DPSGD or something like that?
I see.
Or is it really that the DP guarantee is different?
Firstly, the DP guarantee is the same. Like if we just talk about the output is the DP in the data set, the DP guarantee is the same. But I will talk about like some limitation, in which case this private evolution will outperform the traditional DP fine-tuning method, in which case it's hard. So I will touch that in the later part of the talk. Yeah, there's some like trade-offs, but also there might be some potential to combine these two, like to get the best algorithm. So and private evolution is based on these 3 papers published last year and this year. And in the following part of the talk, I will first talk about the private evolution algorithm, so how the algorithm works, and then I will talk about some results. And lastly, like since we published the paper last year, there are actually some very nice work from the community, not from us, to follow up on private evolution, and they're also very interesting. So they're really extending the private evolution capabilities and applications. So I'll talk about those in the end if time permits. Yeah, firstly about how the algorithm work. So I'll first talk about like what the workflow of private evolution is. So this box represents the data holder. Okay, so the data holder has the user data, and then they will run the private evolution algorithm. And this algorithm will send some API requests to the foundation model. This foundation model can be like third party or hosted in the same party as the data holder. Either way that works. And then the private evolution algorithm will generate this DP synthetic data. Okay. And a thing, as I mentioned, like one important thing that differentiates us from some other method is that we ensure that whatever API request we send to the foundation model is also differentially private. So like it's fine if you use third-party API provider. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned here that this private evolution will need to request some API from the foundation model. So what APIs do we use? So like currently the private evolution will use 2 APIs. Okay. So one is the random API, which means that we just ask the foundation model to generate a random sample. Okay. And the second is the variation API, which is like we send a sample to the foundation model and then ask it to generate some variations. So it might be a little bit abstract. So I will give you concrete examples for like images and text. Like for images, so it's like the random API is just like for example, if you go to DALL-E, you just put a random prompt and the DALL-E model will give you a random image. Okay, so And the variation API is that you send the image to the let's start DALL-E and then ask DALL-E to generate something similar. So in this case, like we send it a bird image and then it generates some similar birds. Okay. So these two APIs are supported by many popular foundation models, including like Stable Diffusion on DALL-E 2. Okay, and then what about text? So it might appear like for text is non-trivial because for text model, like what the only interface the model provides is the chat interface, right? You can chat with GPT models. Then how do we implement this random and the variation API? So actually, because of the instruction following capability of those large language models, it's actually very simple. So let's say we want to generate some restaurant reviews, okay? So the random API would just be like, you just prompt the model, write a random restaurant review for me, and it will generate a random review. Okay. And then for variation API, it's also very simple. Again, using like prompting. We can just say like, please rephrase this review and then put one review into as part of the prompt, and then the model will just generate a variation for you. Yeah. So, and apparently like such APIs can be implemented with any large language models because all of them support this chatting interface. Yeah. So now you may wonder like how we are able to like just utilize these two APIs to generate DP synthetic data without any training. So before talking about how the approach works, I want to first give you some high-level intuition like why how this algorithm works. Okay, so we have the foundation models, right? The foundation model like either GPT or DALL-E. If you visualize their distribution of their generated data, it's going to be very different from the private data set, but it has a very large support. Like because those foundation models, people are trying to train it to be like AGI, right? So it excels in any domain. So the model is actually can generate any kind of realistic data, but the issue here is that if you look at the support of the private data, the distribution of the foundation model might be very low. So their distribution distance is very high. So this means that if we just randomly call the random API from the model to generate some random samples, it's going to be very different from the private data set, right? So in the first step of our algorithm, we just call the random API and generate some random data for me, which is very different from the private data set. Now the key step is the next. So in the next step, we are going to use the private samples to select among the synthetic data samples the ones that are closed to the private samples. Okay, so this is going to be our next set of synthetic data. So here I want to mention here you see population parents. Because this algorithm is motivated from evolutionary algorithm, so it's some terminology in that domain, but you can just think of them as some datasets, some synthetic datasets. Okay, so we use the private sample to select the ones that are close to the private samples, and they form the next set of synthetic datasets. And then we go back, ask the foundation model to create more of those samples that are similar to the private datasets. Okay, and then those samples will be the next synthetic datasets, and we do this loop iteratively, parent selection of offspring generation. Do these two parts iteratively so that the synthetic dataset can gradually moved towards the private dataset through iterations. Okay. So it's the high-level idea of the algorithm, and it might still be a little bit abstract. So I'll give you a concrete example next. Okay. So let's say the private dataset is just some bird images. Okay. So the first step, we're going to ask the foundation model, use the random API to ask it to generate some random images. Okay, so in this case, you see the images are truly random. There's only one. Let's say only one image happened to be bird, but the other images are very different, like plants or cars, etc. Okay, in the next step, for each private sample, we're going to ask them to pick which one is close to it. Okay, so all those three bird images are going to pick the bird images in the generated samples. Okay, now we're going to build a histogram over the synthetic sample. So for each synthetic sample, we count how many private images have been voted for them. Okay, so in this case, the bird image got 3 and the other 2 images got 0. Okay, and And the next step, like we're going to add noise. So this step is the only step in our whole algorithm that access to the private data set. And I didn't talk too much detail about like how DP works, but intuitively you can think about this. So here, like each private sample, the information each private sample contributes is only one, right? So it gives 1 vote to one of the synthetic samples. So like to ensure differential privacy, like one standard mechanism is called Gaussian mechanism. So we just add some Gaussian noise to those histograms. And because each private sample only contributes limited counts, and once we add Gaussian noise, it kind of like confuse the attacker if the attacker want to tell like which vote the private image has been voted to. So intuitively, that's how we can have the differential privacy guarantee. Okay, yeah. So we then just add Gaussian noise, and then in the next step, we're going to resample the synthetic images or called proportional to the noisy counts. So if the one synthetic sample gets more votes, where it's more likely to be kept. Okay. So let's assume like in this case only the bird image got selected.
So what if only it got selected? So am I understanding correctly that like say if the car 0 plus noise would be bigger than 3 plus noise, then
it's possible that the car will be selected.
But you don't select just one. You select like some subset of them. Or
Yes,
is there
yes,
some
subset.
threshold that you said?
Yeah. So actually, we're not just like you said, we're not just selecting one. So there are several variants. Like there are many things we can play with here because the noisy histogram is already DP, so we can do anything with it. So we have several different variants of the algorithm. So for example, we can do just normalize those noisy counts as a distribution, and then draw samples from that distribution. So like I said, like because the car adds some noise, if it is positive, then there's a chance that it can get selected. Yeah, then that's something we have to pay with DP because like we want to have DP, then we have to introduce some randomness and noise. But the intuition here is that like if the bird's image is actually getting a lot of counts, like let's say 1,000, and the other images got 0 in the clean counts, and then we add some Gaussian noise, then it's most likely that we are always going to select the bird image if we just do a proportional distribution sampling. Yeah, but there are also some other algorithms, like for example, instead of doing sampling, because sampling introduces another layer of randomness, which might hurt utility. So we also tried, like for example, we just take the top K sample. Like for the synthetic sample, we just pick the top K that according to the noisy histogram and just select them. Yeah. But there are other maybe better ideas to do it. But yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in this case, we just for simplification, we just assume this bird images got selected and all others are to get dropped. In reality, it may not be the case. Okay. So now, as you can see, like after we do this filtering step, we get one image that is closer to the private data set than the original random data sets. So the next step we're going to do is we call the validation API of the foundation model, ask it to generate more similar images. And because the foundation model has a very great word knowledge, right? So it's going to generate some other realistic bird images. And now we're getting closer to the private data sets. And we will do this iteratively. Okay, so that's how our algorithm can gradually push the generated samples towards the private data set. Okay, yeah. So I'll give you like some more visualization, like to illustrate like what this is doing, because the previous example is just some bird image, which is very simple. In reality, it's going to be much more complicated, much more challenging. So here is the data set, like a medical data set. So this is some like photos of breast cancer cells. And we take a pre-trained model, pre-trained on ImageNet. So as you know, like ImageNet contains some natural photos, like grass, trees, cars, plants, etc. So it's very different from the private data set. And let's see how the private evolution is going to work. So what interesting we found is that by running private evolution, like at the iteration 3, the generative image is already very much closer to the ground truth images in terms of color, but let's see the patterns might still be off. And then if we run the private evolution algorithm for more iterations, it's going to give us something like this. So visually, it looks very similar to private data sets already. Okay, and this is an example on images, and then we can do the similar things for text. So here we're just taking some like a paper reviews as the private data set. So the ground truth sample is something, a paper review about like a reversal detection, etc. And if we run the private evolution, initially like the first iteration of the sample is just some random sample from the diffusion from the large language model. So it's going to give us a random paper review. So it's talking about like a privacy, etc., which is a very different topic. And then through iteration, finally it can give us something about like a reversal text, which is closer to the original ground truth. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So far I have talked about like on the high level like how the algorithm works. Yeah. Do you have any questions before I continue?
I have a really hard time wrapping my head around the like what is exactly the DP guarantee here. Like I don't really understand. So if you go back to a couple slides, to the slide where you add the noise to those counts.
Okay.
Or I mean, maybe you don't have to go back, but like, so what if, like, if I think of it, so what are we protecting here exactly? It's very difficult to somehow.
I see. So we're basically protecting. We're basically trying to limit the information each private sample gives us to the synthetic data sets. Okay. So you can think of like what is each private sample is contribute. So basically we have a vector. The dimension of the vector is the same as the number of synthetic samples.
Each individual private sample.
Each individual, yes.
I see. I understand.
Okay.
So can I think of it as like you're going to use the data set, like say you want to get a data set that's the same size as the original set, and you're going to do this process and you'll end up with like some smaller data set because it's the ones that got enough votes to like be above the threshold or something, and then you'll just say generate something similar and that'll blow it up to the original size?
Yes, exactly, yeah. Good. So, yeah.
So you're sort of looking for like representative.
Yes.
Good representatives. Each step is like you find some good representatives or goodish, and then you use those to generate a bunch of similar things.
Yes.
And then maybe you do another round of that, find the best representatives within there, and then generate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So it's kind of like each iteration. Yeah, we generate a lot of samples, and then it's going to select the subset because like the most frequent, like this bird image might got selected multiple times, and then there are duplicate samples in the selected set, and then we use variation API to basically enlarge the set, and then do the selection. Yeah, so it's really like the evolutionary algorithm. If you have used like it's a kind of traditional old algorithm like kind of like doing this process like iteratively. We select the best from the population from a large set of samples, and then do some perturbations of them, and then select again the perturbation so that it can gradually push towards the optimal. Okay, good. Yeah, so I've talked about how the algorithm works. Now I'm going to go to the results. So one thing we want to compare with the traditional DP fine-tuning based method to see what how the trade-off is. So here like this figure has a lot of like lines, but don't worry, I will explain them one by one. So this is a results on images, and the y-axis is the FID score. So it's a score for measuring the image quality. Lower is better, and the x-axis is the epsilon I talked before. So it's measuring the privacy guarantee. The smaller the better. Okay, and each line here is basically a trade-off curve between quality and the privacy of one algorithm. And in particular, this like a yellow line is the previous state-of-the-art method based on DP fine-tuning from Google in 2023. Okay, and this red line is our private evolution. So actually, in these data sets, we see that we actually achieve, without the need of doing any training, we actually achieve even better trade-off than those fine-tuning based approach. Like in particular, let's say if we want to achieve like this FID maybe like around 8 or 9. Like the previous method requires epsilon 32, and our method only requires epsilon smaller than 1. So if you are familiar with differential privacy, this epsilon is actually in the exponential scale, and even in that case, we still like improve such quite a lot. Yeah, and this is a result on text. Okay, good.
Third dimension, which is the cost.
The cost.
The cost. Like the
Yeah. I will talk about computation cost.
Computation.
Yeah, I will talk about it like two slides later. Yeah, and then this is a result on text. Okay, so like here we're just basically like generating synthetic data set and train the downstream text classification algorithm and measure their accuracy. And the first row here is a DP fine-tuning method. So it's again the previous state of the art. So it's published in 2023 and got a honorable mention paper award in ACO. Okay, so its accuracy is 32, and our algorithm can give it a 37. Okay, so yeah, which is a significant boost. And as you can see, like this method, the state-of-the-art method, is actually based on GPT-2, which is a very old method. Like, but it still won the honorable paper mention award that year. It's again because like it is the best thing people can do with DP fine-tuning. Like at that time, like we have better models, but it's really in terms of implementation and computation costs, it's really tricky to get DP fine-tuning work for them. So at that time, like this is the best people can do. But this again is based on the same model. If we apply private evolution, we can get a benefit. And moreover, as I said, like private evolution allows you to easily scale up with more advanced models because it only requires inference API. So it's very easy to implement. So here we extend the previous table. Like the first two rows is from the previous slide. And in the following, we tried a bunch of other open source models and also like closed source model like GPT 3.5. And as you see, like we can, with more advanced model, can get even better accuracy, 43. Okay. Yeah, it is in terms of the trade-off between quality and privacy. And the other question, like you asked, is about like computation cost. So for text and images under the same model, so it's a fair comparison. We can give up to like a 65% speed up for text and then 2.5% times speed up for images. So computationally, it's also cheaper if we use the same model. Yeah. So
it's very difficult to measure, right? I mean, these computations happen. Some happen in GPU, some happen in CPU. So it's like a very different distribution.
Yeah, exactly. So what we do is actually like a kind of in favor of DP fine-tuning. So what we do is that we just take the GPU hours for DP fine-tuning because they only require GPU. And then for our method, there are some steps that only runs on CPU because, for example, we do the voting, etc., aggregate the votes. So what we do is that we aggregate, we plus like the GPU hours of a method plus the CPU hours of a method and add them together and do this comparison. So it's actually like unfair to us because CPU is cheaper, right? But even in that case, we can see the speed up.
Nice.
So these numbers, is this for like you generate the synthetic data and then you fine tune them?
Oh, it's only for the generation process. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the thing you had, they're all for generating synthetic data. Also the fine tuning.
Yeah. So for both methods, it's only for DP fine tuning we can compute because they need a fine tuning process. So it's fine tuning plus generation. For our method, it's only the generation process. So yeah, we take the time of that. Yeah, but regarding your question, I also want to mention that because like for our method, the majority of time still like calling the API. The random API and variation API. So those CPU hours we count them because but they are very tiny. So it's also negligible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So far it's all about like great things about private evolution, and I also want to mention some limitations of it, which goes back to Kim's question. So like private evolution like requires a foundation models, and because it doesn't do any training on that. So if there's actually a very large distribution shift between the pre-training data of foundation model and your private data sets, then it's kind of challenging to make a private evolution to work well. Like so, for example, here it's a very simple data set. So just endless data sets, some black-white images of handwritten digits. Okay, and now if we apply the state-of-the-art DP fine-tuning approach, it's going to give us very good samples like this. So there's a recognizable digits. And if we train the downstream classifier on classify which digit it is, it's going to give us very good accuracy, 97%. Okay, and now let's say we use we use private evolution. So we take a foundation model pre-trained on ImageNet. So it's the same model I mentioned before, and we ask it to generate MNIST. So it's going to give us something like this. So it gets something correct, which is actually already surprising to me. It gets something like black in the background, white in the foreground. But as you see, like the quality is very bad. I mean, in many images, there's no recognizable digits. Okay, and if we train a downstream classification algorithm, like it's going to only have 30% accuracy.
Does it get any better if you run them more rounds?
No, yeah. So it just stay here no matter how long you run.
Do you have intuition for why?
Yeah, exactly. So like because like a P does not modify the weights of the foundation model. So whatever it generates still depends on like what the foundation model is able to. Like for example, if the foundation model, in this case, you never seen like these black white images in his training data. So it's really hard to adapt like a foundation model towards such a distribution. But on the contrary, because DP fine-tuning, so here the DP fine-tuning approach is based on the same foundation model, so it's fair. But they can adapt the weights of the foundation model, so it can change like the generative distribution of foundation model more dramatically. Yeah. Yeah, but I'm going to like revisit this limitation and mention like one possible solution to it in the next part. Okay. Yeah. So far it's about like the results of private evolution, and after like we published like this work last year. Like, there's actually several very interesting follow-up work, like some by us, but also more by like the community. And something I really like very interesting in terms of like really utilizing the benefit of private evolution to expand its capability and also apply private evolution into other domains as well. So yeah, I mean for full paper list you can go to this URL, but yeah, I'm going to mention several of them which I think is very interesting. Okay, so the first paper is this like by Zhou et al. Like from Tsinghua University, like just published like last month. So I mean, this paper has many interesting ideas, but I'll only just mention one. So the motivation is that like the private evolution, as we mentioned, we utilize foundation models, but there are many foundation models out there, right? And different foundation model might focus on different domains or have different capabilities. Now the question is, can we utilize all of them to boost the synthetic data quality? Okay, so as you imagine, actually for private evolution, it's very simple to do because private evolution in the end, it only requires two things. Like as I mentioned, random API to generate the random sample and the variation API, which is like given sample generates something similar. And all those foundation models, no matter what their architecture is or what developer is, they like even like some from OpenAI API, some from Cloud API, some from Google like Gemini API, they provide same API to us. So it's kind of like they provide same interface to private evolution. So it's very easy to port all of them together into the private evolution framework. And this is their idea. And if we think about like the DP fine-tuning, it's kind of more challenging to do because like again, DP fine-tuning requires a special implementation. So if you want to do it for DP fine-tuning, you have to modify the code base of each model separately. And also, like each time you do a fine-tuning on one model, you have additional privacy cost. So it's really harder to scale up if we want to do similar thing for DP fine-tuning. Yeah, and it shows some very, very promising results. So here is like if you do like apply on open source model. So this OGP is our private evolution, and they try like different open source models, and each column here is a different like data sets. And the numbers are some like accuracy of downstream classifier, so it's higher the better. So if we use each foundation model separately, we're going to get accuracy like this. But if we use their algorithm to utilize all the models together, we're going to get the best accuracy. Okay, so it's really like benefiting from utilizing knowledge from multiple foundation models. Yeah, and now you may have one question like, what if we just use a single model that has the best capability in the world? In that case, do we still need to use multiple models? So they also have a very interesting result. So let's say we use some closed source model, GPT 3.5, GPT 4, GPT-4, apparently like GPT-4 has the best performance like in many domains. And what they say is that also in this case, like if we use their algorithm to utilize all the three models, you are going to get some benefit compared to utilizing the single models alone, which kind of intuitively also makes sense to me, because even if like let's say GPT-4 in general like is better than 3.5 and 4, I mean it's really hard to imagine like if it can like outperform them in all domains, because all those three has very good capability. They are both foundation models, frontier models. So there might be cases where like some models, like older models 3.5, 4 outperform GPT-4. So it still makes sense like to combine multiple models in this case. Yeah. So this is one which is really scale up the model, foundation model, the number of foundation models. And the second paper is one step further. So it is by us. So again, like foundation models, private evolution rely on foundation models, but like the Omnis example we mentioned before, like foundation models is not available. Suitable foundation model is not available in every data domain. Like for example, for the TOEIC case, like handwritten digits. Yeah, it's one example that we might not be able to have a good foundation model for that. Then in this case, we already see that the private evolution is going to have a worse performance. But the key thing here now is that like in the data generative domains, it's not at least till today, like it's not everything is about foundation models. There are many other like data synthesis tools out there where foundation model is not suitable. Like for example, for networking domain, like if you think about like generating networking packets, like there's no good foundation model yet, but there's a lot of network simulators that can generate network packets. And if we talk about like images and videos, there are many like computer graphics based tools that can generate good images and videos. So for example, like let me give you some concrete examples. So maybe you have heard of like Genesis. So it's getting very popular like end of last year and this year. So it's a framework for generating like robotics data. And there's like an Unreal Engine and Blender. So there are like the popular tool for generating images and videos for like a gaming or for movies. Okay, so in those domain, like the state environment is still utilizing those tools instead of foundation models. Now the question is, can we utilize their capability for DP image synthesis or DP data synthesis as well? And the idea is, again, yes. Like in the previous work, we see that we can use, because we have the same API, we can easily scale up the number of models. But moreover, we can actually use the same API to scale up even beyond the foundation models, because those tools can also provide the same API to us. One random API, the other is variation API. Okay, so because they provide the same interface, there's no reason like why private evolution cannot utilize them. Utilize those tools together. So in terms of private evolution, it's actually like a broader, like it expand the capability of private evolution a lot. But also in terms of DP image synthesis, like previously, again, state-of-the-art is based on foundation models or pre-trained models, but now we introduce those powerful data synthesis tool into the DP data synthesis domain as well. Mm-hmm.
What is like getting a random image from Blender?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I didn't go into the detail, but we can think of like those computer graphics based model. On a high level, we can think of like, let's say we want to generate human face images. Then you can just provide some parameters to it. Like for example, the face identity. So they have a database of like different face identity, and you just provide the ID of face identity. You provide the ID of the hairstyle. You provide the ID of like skin color. You provide the ID of the background color. Like you provide some numbers about the face rotation, etc., and then you can render a human face image for you. So what a random API we do here is that we just randomly draw parameters and ask the model to generate images. And for variation API, we just do some random perturbation on those parameters. For example, randomly draw another face ID, like randomly add some Gaussian noise, uniform noise to the angle of the face. Yeah, and then put it to the engine, and then can render a face for us. Yeah, it's actually even simpler than foundation model. Yeah, you just perturb, not like doing some perturbation like on the image itself, but just some very low dimensional parameters. Yeah, And let's see some results. So this is the example I showed before where a private evolution fails. And now if we use this private evolution based on some data synthesis tool, so here we created a toy case, which is just a text renderer program. It can generate some good digits for us, and then it can significantly boost the classification accuracy. Okay. Yeah, and in the paper also have some study actually we can also combine data synthesis tool with foundation model altogether because each of them has some separate benefits, and if we combine them together, we can actually have even better results. And why we can combine them together again because P only requires the APIs, and if those two provide the same API, we can very easily utilize them together in the one generation process.
When you combine them together, when you're asking for variations,
Are you asking for like variations from an image? So like if the image came out of this model, but then you can ask a different model for variations, or do you have to sort of
Yeah. That's a great question. So currently we use a very simple implementation, which is we first use this data synthesis tool, and then in the second stage we switch to foundation model. So the idea is that the data synthesis tool have a better control on the diversity of the samples. So we can have a very good seed samples, but they may not be very realistic as real images, let's say face images. So, and then in the second stage, we use the foundation model so that it can polish those images to make them more realistic, something like that. Yeah. And the third paper is one step even further, expand. So we talk about private evolution for DP image synthesis, but actually can also benefit other domains as well. So it is a paper from Ho et al. From CML and Meta last year, and they won the ICML Oral Award. So it's applied on federated learning. So just a quick recap on what federated learning is. So federated learning is considered a case where there are a lot of clients, distributed clients. So let's say each client is your mobile phone, and they host some data, like your own data, and the service provider wants to train a machine learning model based on all the data from all the devices together, but at the same time they want to keep the data local at each device so that it's private. Okay, so the traditional approach is that the central server has the model and then broadcast the model to each device, and each device do some training based on their local data, and then send the model updates back to the server, and server aggregates those updates and then go to the next iteration. But apparently, now we're dealing with large model again, so it's very expensive to train, especially on your mobile phone with very limited resources, it's hard to train. And secondly, because model is very large, so if you communicate those models, it's going to be very communication expensive. And what their approach is apply private evolution into this federated learning domain. So they have a foundation model, they generate some synthetic data, and they send the data to the client instead of model. And then the client can use the private evolution process I mentioned to do the voting, select the best one, and aligns with local data, and send the votes back to the server. And the server aggregates the votes and do the selection and gets the next iteration of synthetic data and do this iteratively. And finally, we get a DP synthetic data that represents all the clients, and then we do the fine-tuning, normal fine-tuning.
And they did local DP in this case?
Yes, local DP, and it's going to have a cheaper client communication and computation. Because the time is out, so I'm going to summarize very fast. So we discussed the private evolution, and the goal is to unlock the value of the user data while ensuring protecting their privacy. And we developed this private evolution framework, which requires no training, no weights, so it can compatible with open source model, API-based models, or even no neural network tools. It's computationally cheap. It works for multiple domains, and it can match or even outperform DP fine-tuning in some domains. And we have open source this code on GitHub, this Python library. So this library is intended to put all the the long-term goal is to put all things advances about private evolution in one place. With this very modular design, so that different advances in different components can be combined together easily. So we also very welcome a community contribution to this library, and also we have this repo contains all the papers from the about private evolution. So like after we published this private evolution last year, actually now there are even more follow-up work from community than from us. So yeah, and I also discuss three of them, but there are many other interesting works. So you can check out this repo for the paper list. Yeah, that's the end of the talk. Thank you.
Well, I guess this is the official end of the talk, so nothing beyond this should be in the recording. And I guess we can, if there are any questions that are internal, that would be a good chance to ask.